Heather, good morning. Essentially, we're just going to ask you to empty the bucket on everything you know so fans can get up to date, starting with when exactly Trevor Lawrence's quarantine begins and the 10-day clock commences.
So, Zubin, that's the biggest question. Trevor Lawrence tested positive on Wednesday. He got his result back Thursday, but the 10-day clock begins with the onset of symptoms, which is unclear when that was. Now, if he can return for the Notre Dame game, obviously that's a big deal. But look, I spoke with CFP Executive Director Bill Hancock last night, and while he declined to speculate on any hypotheticals, he did say that the selection committee considers availability of players. If you look at the CFP protocol, which has not changed since the inception of the playoff, it talks about injuries to players. And he said the right word should be availability, because they also consider suspensions and ejections from games and things like that. So if he's not available, the selection committee will obviously take that into consideration in their deliberations, but we just don't know yet if he'll be back for that game. And by the way, guys, they have to beat Boston College without him first.
How would they look at it? Let's say, for instance, Heather, if they don't beat a Boston College without Trevor Lawrence and they lose to a Notre Dame with Trevor Lawrence?
See, that's where I think it gets more interesting than the win or lose Notre Dame. I think if you're talking about a 2-loss Clemson, then that gets really tricky, because what happens is the selection committee would then evaluate Clemson through the backstretch of the season with him. Are they a top 4 team with him in the lineup regardless of those 2 losses? The answer is probably yes, they are. We've seen that through the first half of the season. But how do those 2 losses hurt them in the long run? Would they put them in anyway? Look, what we know about Clemson's backup quarterback, I'll go ahead and let Zubin pronounce his last name for me, but what we know is that he was an extremely good high school player coming out of California, and he's played some in mop-up duty, and Clemson within the program is very confident in his abilities heading into this game against Boston College. But again, it is, what do they look like with him in the lineup?
And Jay, real quick, DJ Uiagalelei to answer Heather's question from Bellflower, California, a 5-star prospect who eventually will be the heir apparent to Trevor Lawrence, and in some ways will be the heir apparent at least for one game tomorrow. Jay.
Don't worry, Heather. I just call him DJU. That's what we call him.
That's a good
It
call.
makes it simplistic.
There we go.
How will CFP view the different protocols from different conferences?
So that's a great question. Look, at the end of the day, it's not rocket science. And I continue to remind everyone, it is who did you beat? And without those non-conference games to really help say, okay, this is how the SEC matches up against the ACC this year, it's more strength of conference, right? And don't forget, in terms of the ACC, Notre Dame being a part of that conference this year, even if Clemson were to lose that game on the road, they still potentially can avenge that loss in the ACC championship game. And then if you're looking at a scenario where Clemson and Notre Dame split, the ACC could make a case for 2 teams in the college football playoff, depending on what happens throughout those other Power 5 conference championship games. So this is huge news, obviously, because of who it is, Trevor Lawrence. But in the big picture, it might not quite change Clemson's playoff position in the long run.
It's a fascinating point because you juxtapose, Heather, those 2 days, and it could be something, right? You get there and you say December 19th, that would be the rematch in the ACC title game, because for the casual fan that may not be aware, because this year is so different, that Notre Dame is essentially considered a full ACC member and they are eligible for the ACC title game. They could play Clemson in that game with Trevor Lawrence on December 19th. And then basically 24 hours later, the committee would have to figure out if Clemson or Notre Dame or both potentially could make the playoff. That could be an unbelievable 24 hours, and that's what Heather is referring to. Last thing, the playoff has been around since 2014. It's not exactly a grand old dame here, but how has the committee viewed player absences of a high ilk like Lawrence in the past?
Well, look, we've seen it with Trevor Lawrence. Guys, I looked it up last night because I remember this. 2018, Clemson's playing Syracuse. Trevor Lawrence gets knocked out of the game, which what I think was a head injury, and Chase Bryce goes in and comes in and wins the day for them. It was a very close game. I want to say they won like 27-23, 24, something like that. And the big question was, they didn't look too great in that game. What is the selection committee going to think with Trevor Lawrence injured in that game? And in the end, it didn't impact them because they won every game and they made it to the CFP. But we have seen this happen before. And look, again, the question is, what do they look like without him in the lineup? What do they look like down the stretch with him in the lineup? At the end of the day, it's, are they a top 4 team down the stretch when the committee rankings start? And look, they don't even start till November 24th. So there's plenty of time for Clemson to figure this out.
There's no question about it. We're used to those late October rankings, but obviously that's been truncated since the season has been truncated. We just scratched the surface with Heather on the biggest story in sports this morning, and I encourage you, if you're really interested in that, to keep with us all morning long. We'll talk about it, but there's also a great piece by Heather and her colleague David M. Hale on ESPN.com right now. It takes you through all the particulars. Heather, thanks for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Happy Friday, Heather.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys.
Hey.
One thing I quickly want to mention, according to CFP protocols, Heather mentioned this, guys, in her first answer, but this is worth repeating. Remember, the protocols went into place 2014 when the Ohio State University won the first college football playoff. We're now entering the 7th.
Thank you for saying the
college football playoff. Obviously, when the rules were put in place in 2014, nobody could have foresaw a once-in-a-century plus pandemic. So right now, the rules do state, since the rules were put in place in 2014 when this 14 playoff began, that key injuries that may have affected a team's performance during the season could be taken into account when observing comparable teams. You don't have a player, somebody else is comparable, they do. How do you look at it?